Hello, everyone. I'm Dean Glass, and I welcome you to Penning the Past, Insights into San Diego's Historic Neighborhoods and Architecture. Today, we're thrilled to explore the fascinating history of La Jolla, famously known as the Jewel. Renowned for its natural beauty and Mediterranean-like climate, La Jolla boasts magnificent seascapes, caves, bathing coves, and sandy beaches that have captivated visitors and developers and residents since the 1880s. Guiding us through La Jolla's storied past is Carol Olten, the historian for the La Jolla Historical Society and a former journalist specializing in art, film, history, and architecture. A longtime resident of La Jolla, Carol owns and resides in one of the community's oldest homes. Carol's writing is educational, investigative, and intriguing, covering a wide range of topics from the history of movie theaters in La Jolla to the development and construction of its most iconic historic buildings. If you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat feature and Carol will answer them at the end of the program. Prepare to be enchanted by the rich history of La Jolla as told by one of its most dedicated historians. Please join me in welcoming Carol Olten.
Okay, thank you, Soho, for inviting me to this wonderful program or series of programs you're doing. He mentioned my newspaper career, and that was a great deal of fun. And I'm remembering the start of it a lot this summer because the Beatles gave a concert here in August of 1964. And it was the first rock music show that I reviewed for the newspaper. And to this day, I still remember the press conference before the Beatles came on. They were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they were holding a press conference, and it was like, a big scene. They were sitting there with their boxes of chicken and eating away and trying to talk about their music, which they didn't seem to have much to say about it. But anyway, it was a real night of frenzy at the old Balboa Stadium. But we're not here to talk about the Beatles, obviously. We are here to talk about some of the writers who have lived and worked in La Jolla over a period of many years. La Jolla has always had a very rich culture and a fairly diverse culture in terms of the people who have lived and worked here. And writers, of course, are no exception. In the early part of the 20th century and actually late 19th century, a lot of creative people accumulated around, of course, Anna Hill's Green Dragon Colony, including a writer named Rose Hardwick Thorpe. And Miss Thorpe was actually instrumental in naming the Green Dragon Colony. um, she suggested the name from an inn she had stayed at in, I think it was either Switzerland or Austria, while she was writing a romantic novel. And Anna Held had wanted a place, a name to call the place, and she suggested, well, I was at this inn in Switzerland or wherever, and it was named the Green Dragon Colony. So that's how the Green Dragon Colony got its name. But anyway, the early years also saw a number of other writers that were around here in La Jolla. L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, he spent part of the summer here of 1905, and he actually wrote three of his children's stories here in La Jolla while he was residing here and enjoying the resort weather we had in the summer. One of them was called Seafaries, and it's a really beautiful little book about an old man and his friend, a little girl, and they live on one of the cliffs here, and they decide they want to go rowing, so they go rowing, and somehow their little boat drifts into the one of the caves, and they encounter a mermaid, and the mermaid says, "Would you like to go see my kingdom?" And they say, "Of course." So they spend their day underwater and exploring the ocean, and of course they're home for their dinner in the old house on the cliff. Lovely little story, L. Frank Baum. Baum was also instrumental in the naming of the Sunny Gem Cave that we have here in La Jolla, the one that you climb down into and you can go under the ground and look at the cave. That was created also in the early 20th century, about 1903. The cave was actually dug by Professor Gustav Scholz, and while he was living here in La Jolla, Baum made his acquaintance, and of course they were talking about the silhouette and how it could be named. And Mr. Baum suggested, well, why don't you call it Sunny Jim, because it looks just like this cartoon character they're using to advertise cereal. So that's how Sunny Jim got its name. Another of the lady writers that we had around in the early days was Ellen Mills. Ellen was the daughter of Anson and Nellie Mills, and they had moved here from Maine. And Ellen was a poet, quite a well-known and published poet. She um, contributed to a number of poetry anthologies, and she wrote a poem about La Jolla. It was called The Lure, and it was quite popular, and it was used in early advertising of La Jolla as a resort community. But probably from that early group, the one that came to be nationally known here in La Jolla, or was nationally known when he came to La Jolla, he was an elderly man already, was John Burroughs. He was an essayist on nature, and he lived in the woods in upstate New York, and he always came out in the winter to get away from the cold winters. And he was a guest usually of Virginia Scripps, who owned Wisteria Cottage. And in the summer of 1920 and 1921, he came to live in that cottage. And he writes in some of his essays about the visit to La Jolla. And I want to read just a couple of short excerpts from John Burroughs. He was going to celebrate Christmas here on his first building, and he wrote in his journal, "Christmas. The Pacific furnished the music, the sky furnished the glory, and Miss Scripps, Virginia, furnished the dinner. Never spent a Christmas in such an environment before. What splendor, what novelty." And here we have a picture of this is from my timekeeper magazine that I do for the History Society. I edit the publication. Anyway, we did a profile piece on John Burroughs, and here he is in 1920. Wait, there. He's standing in front of Wisteria Cottage where he was staying. And he actually visited a lot of other locations in San Diego when he was out here on his trip. And he wrote about the ocean life he found here, and he called sea lions the hounds of the sea. He didn't like sea lions at all. So anyway, this is an excerpt from one of his writings, and I think John Burroughs, he had lovely descriptions of places. Um, he was talking about his trip to the Imperial Valley here, and he wrote, "The sail is made up of the finest silk, the very flowers of the rock. It is greasy and sticky. Here is the dump of the gods who excavated the Grand Canyon." And the word I misread was not sail, it's silt. So he was describing silt. Anyway, he was a contemporary of Walt Whitman and guys like Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. And he was great friends with the Scripps ladies. Actually, Ellen Browning Scripps asked him to sit for a portrait that was done by a local artist. And the portrait was given to Ellen Browning Scripps, or she actually commissioned him and she paid for it. But anyway, it was in her home for many years, and it is now in the collection at the Natural History Museum. This is the portrait of Mr. Burroughs that was done here in La Jolla. Anyway, I want to talk to you about a lot of the well. Before we move on, let's talk about one more person in the early days. And he's one of my favorite people because, well, I live in his house and I own his house. I bought his house in 1996. It's a small cottage, a beach cottage that was built on the Park Row Circle in 1908. And Mr. Adams built it. He was a playwright from New York, and he wrote several plays while he was here and living in La Jolla. And he had been kind of a drifter around from the East Coast, and then he drifted out to California, and he lived here for about 4 or 5 years, and eventually he ended up moving to Coronado, where he wrote a biography of John Spreckles, John B. Spreckles. Anyway, this is Mr. H. Austin Adams, and this, here is the house that he built on Park Row Circle, and it's the very house, it was the first house built on the Circle Park, and it's the house that I presently own and live in with my favorite Samoyed dog, Nanook. So anyway, but Mr. Adams was going to sell the house in 1913, and he wrote this very funny description for the salesman. And he says, owner returning to barbarism, for sale, the Dreamery. The house was called the Dreamery. He wrote for the ad in the Foghand newspaper of 1913. The picturesque and unique residence of H. Austin Adams, the sage of La Jolla, would be desirable citizen anywhere else. Fully furnished house, 2 built-in mortgages, good as new, linen closet, with complete stock of rejected manuscripts, literary atmosphere in every room, all modern conveniences, including gas, water, and a lawn snap. Don't delay. And he did get a buyer shortly afterward. And what he advertised as a lawn snap is beyond me. I've never been able to figure out what he was talking about with the lawn snap. Maybe somebody will ask a question about that or know in the question and answer period. Anyway, his time in La Jolla, he had a love-hate relationship, I think, with La Jolla. He had he didn't like the he hated La Jolla because he thought sometimes it was very smug, and he didn't like what he called the stuffy little hypocritical humbug existence approved by the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. So he thought we were a little snobby, I guess. But anyway, he did spend some time here, and he stayed around for a while. So that being said, I think we should move on and talk a little bit about some of the really famous writers we had in La Jolla. And of course, the 2 that immediately come to mind are, of course, Raymond Chandler, and we can't forget our beloved Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel, who wrote all of his, a good deal of his children's stories here. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, all of the famous ones. I don't need to repeat the titles. But he lived in a tower and a house he developed around the tower in Celia Drive up on Mount Soledad. And the thing about, he bought the house because he really loved the view. And he spent a lot of time there, and he had a lovely studio. And I interviewed him once there. I've forgotten, he'd come out with one of his books, and the newspaper was writing a story about it, obviously, and I was sent to interview him. And I remember he had the Cat in the Hat. The famous Cat in the Hat was right there on his front mailbox. And he was a extremely funny fellow, a pleasant fellow, and I enjoyed doing the interview a lot. And one of the things he said to me, I asked him, well, why did you want to live on this hill up here overlooking all the village? And he said, well, because he said, I'm higher than any person in town, including your boss. And of course, my boss was James and Helen Copley. And so he was very proud that he lived on top of everything and on top of the publishing business in San Diego. So anyway, other writers from the mid-century period here were, of course, Raymond Chandler, Walt Mason. There was a pulp western guy who was named Walt Colburn, and he wrote a lot here in La Jolla. He had a small house here on Prospect Street. Max Miller, of course, the author of On the Waterfront, and he also wrote a book that was called Town with a Funny Name, which was a story about La Jolla and essentially a group of essays about La Jolla and what it was like living here. And I'm going to read a little bit from that book. Um, and of course, we have the man who wrote the first history book, Howard S.F. Randolph. The first history book was published in the late 40s. It was called La Jolla Year by Year. And it was an attempt by Mr. Randolph. He was essentially, he came out here from New York City. He was had been a genealogist with the New York City Library, and he came out here and he looked around. And he said, you know, La Jolla is such an interesting place, you know, and you have nothing that you know, records the history of it, of the Green Dragon colony, the history of Ellen Browning Scripps and the Scripps legacy, etc. So he decided that he would start collecting old photographs. And at that point, the La Jolla Historical Society was part of the it was part of what was called the library committee at the Athenaeum Art and Music Library. Anyway, so this group got together and they formed a little history committee or group, and they helped Mr. Randolph get a lot of photographs together and interview people, and he published this first La Jolla history book. It's called La Jolla Year by Year, and you can buy copies of it these days at the Athenaeum or sometimes in our bookstore. D.G. Wills, he usually has old copies that come from estates he cleans out when he cleans out libraries in some of the old estates around La Jolla. Anyway, it's a great little anecdotal book about the history of La Jolla, and it goes in from the beginnings in 1887 to about 1940. And there's another book on the history of La Jolla written by Pat Shacklin, of course, which is very well researched, and it is called La Jolla Story of the Community, which can be picked up, I think, at the La Jolla Public Library and maybe Warwick's. I'm not sure at this point. So anyway, let's talk about Chandler. I want to talk about Chandler to some extent because Mr. Chandler, who was born in Chicago in 1888, would have celebrated his 136th, I think it is, birthday on July 23 of this year. Chandler really, I think, came to live in La Jolla because he wanted to get out of Los Angeles. He was very famous already as a writer, and his books had been made into movies. The Big Sleep, Farewell My Lovely, all of those ones. And there was a time when Raymond Chandler was actually the highest paid writer at Paramount Studios. And he is said to have made $100,000 a week, which is an awful lot for anybody in the 1940s, early 50s. But anyway, he decided he wanted to get away from all of the Hollywood aura of LA. And so he decided he would settle down and live quietly in La Jolla. Which he pretty much did. He didn't. He wasn't like a community leader. He didn't participate in clubs or anything of that nature. He really liked to have his privacy. And when he first came here, he rented a number of different houses here and there. And then he finally bought a house on Camino de la Costa, which is still standing, but has gone through a great deal of renovations since Mr. Chandler left it in the late 50s. Anyway, Chandler, again, he was one of these people who had a love-hate relationship with La Jolla. He liked La Jolla because it was a getaway from Los Angeles, I think, but he also resented La Jolla for being very quiet and in the 50s especially, more a retirement environment to live in. And so I want to read a little bit about what he said about La Jolla, and then we want to talk too about his last novel that he wrote called Playback, in which La Jolla serves as the model for a town in the book that is named Esmeralda. And it's a very funny book. It's, his favorite detective, Philip Marlowe, is trying to solve a murder, and maybe it's a homicide, we don't know, or if it's a suicide. And Marlowe goes sort of schlepping around the village area, and he goes and visits the Marine room, and there's a funny scene that's written in the Marine room with people at the cocktail hour in the 50s. And he also witnesses a suicide in one of the oldest houses that we have here in La Jolla. It's called the Villa Waldo, built in 1894. And in Chandler's time and in our own time, it's still standing in an alley on Drury Lane. It was originally built on Girard, but they moved it to the alley in the 1930s. And anyway, Chandler decided he was so intrigued by this house that he decided to stage one scene in his playback book in the Villa Waldo, and that was a man hanging himself in the Villa Waldo. So anyway, um, the other places in La Jolla that are mentioned in the book, of course, La Valencia, our hotel, the Pink Lady Hotel, built in 1926-27, is mentioned in the book as a hotel which is called El Puente, I believe. But anyway, and there's a couple of scenes actually that end up taking place in the La Valencia in Esmeralda in playback. So that being said, let's see what Mr. Chandler said about La Jolla. He says, like most towns, Esmeralda, La Jolla, had one main street from which in both directions its commercial establishments flowed gently for a sharp block or so, and then, with hardly a change of mood, became streets with houses where people lived. But unlike most small California towns, it had no false fronts, no cheesy billboards, no drive-in hamburger joints, no cigar counters or pool rooms, and no street corner toughs to hang around in front of them. The stores on Grand Street, Girard Avenue, were either old and narrow, but not tawdry, or else well modernized with plate glass and stainless steel fronts and neon lighting in clear, crisp colors. The stores that sold luxury goods were as neat and as expensive looking as those in Beverly Hills and far less flashy. There was another small difference too. In Esmeralda, what was old was also clean and sometimes quaint. In other small towns, what is old is just shabby. I think that's a wonderful description of probably La Jolla in the 50s. Um, anyway, Chandler lived here until his death in 1959. Um, his main residence, of course, was on Camino de la Costa. And but after his wife died, his wife was ill, and she died at she was older than he, but she died at a fairly early age, and so did he. I think he was in his 60s, maybe 70. I have to look it up. But anyway, Mr. Chandler, after his wife died, he decided, he attempted suicide and all sorts of bad goings on in this house where he had lived with his wife, and decided it was time to get out of there. And so he decided to sell the house, and he rented a small cottage here on Prospect Street. And he went back in the winter of 1959 to see his publisher in New York City. And in the course of being in New York in the winter, he got a bad cold. He came back home here, and of course, it had turned into pneumonia. And he was hospitalized at the old Scripps Memorial Hospital on Prospect Street. And he died there on, I believe it was the 26th of March, 1959. And interesting thing, He was buried here in San Diego in Mount Hope Cemetery, where his remains are still interred. And there are several accounts of his funeral, of course, that have been written in various newspapers, but it's reported that only 17 people attended his funeral. And it's very kind of sad to think that nobody had remembered the fellow who had written all of these wonderful detective stories and, been such a high-paid writer at Paramount Studio in Los Angeles. And it was sort of like with his death in the 50s, his whole literary oeuvre was, forgotten about for a while at least. Today, Raymond Chandler is still, probably, one of our most renowned writers of uh, the detective genre. And, we should feel very proud and lucky that he did live in La Jolla. And at one point in time, there was a fellow I knew who owned the Raymond Chandler house down in Camino de la Costa by the ocean, and he decided we should get together and have a Raymond Chandler club. And so we had a Raymond Chandler club for a while. He ended up selling his house and moving on, and then the club kind of fell apart. But we would get together, and on his birthday especially, we would read some of the Raymond Chandler stories. And we wanted to at least remember Raymond Chandler's memory. Um, Another author, of course, from the mid-century years that is fairly well known is Max Miller. Max Miller wrote the best-selling book On the Waterfront, which was made into a wonderful picture with Marlon Brando, a young Marlon Brando, as the star of it. And Chandler, or Miller, excuse me, please, um, lived um, also in the same area where Raymond Chandler lived. I don't know if they ever knew each other or hung out together. I have no idea. I know that Max Miller, he was enamored of the ocean, and he loved to walk by the ocean, and he wrote a number of pieces about the ocean and his observances of it and the tourists and all of that while he was here in La Jolla. Um, the book, The Town with a Funny Name, is all about La Jolla, and it has an inside back cover that has all these little sketches of life in La Jolla, which is involved with fishing and rowing and looking at scenery of the cove and all that sort of thing. So I want to read a little bit from Max Miller and what he thinks about the name of La Jolla. Here he's talking about La Jolla is a small town, but a little atypical of small towns generally in other places of the USA. And he says, unlike so many other places too, even places in California, this little town has no traditions. That is, traditions measured in terms of a century or so. On another way of wording, it could be that the traditions of the little town are just beginning and may not come to a head until 50 years from now. But if they do come to a head, nobody knows, inasmuch as traditions or influences or even future memories are beyond anyone's ability to predict. Yet, as for traditions, there certainly are no ancient cathedrals in this little town, or any old missions or old forts, and for that matter, no old battlegrounds which changed history. The nearest such battle site, if such it could be called, is some 40 miles away, and nobody pays much attention to it simply because the small battle of San Pasqual changed nothing, did not have to be fought. Besides, the Americans in this battle got hell knocked out of them by old Californians, fighting mainly with lances. But afterwards, things went on the same as usual. Everybody got chummy again. It was neither a Thermopylae nor a Bunker Hill. It was merely a momentary mess. Max Miller, talking about small towns, La Jolla in particular, and he has this about the name. We of La Jolla do not really know what our own name actually means, other than it obviously is not that of a saint. The poetically minded say that La Jolla in Spanish means the jewel, but it does not mean the jewel in Spanish. Others say that La Jolla is a misspelled Indian word meaning the whole, and refers, so they say, to our valley-like indentures between our mesa and our shore. But this interpretation is wide open for argument too, and especially since our aborigines around here were as stupid and lazy as could be found on the continent, and did not really have a true language, or much of anything else, and did not care to be bothered. You have to remember that this Max Miller essay and book is being written in the 1940s, and we had a different way of looking at things, shall we say. He goes on, grunts were sufficient for a vocabulary, the same as lizards or grasshoppers were sufficient for a meal. And so the Aborigines would have been the most surprised of all possibly to have known that La Jolla was now being credited to them. And he goes on, he talks about, our post office, and he says that we really should have a name that could be attributed to something. And he concludes by saying, for after all, we do have our own post office. We are legal. Nice stuff from Max Miller. Um, well, I try to, when I write and I edit this Timekeeper magazine, as I was saying, for our La Jolla Historical Society. And I guess my writing, I try to develop different stories about La Jolla. I want to talk about that a little bit. La Jolla has so many legacies, so many legendary legacies in people like Ellen Browning Scripps, in people like Roger Rebel, who was instrumental in starting the university, in people like the famous Dr. William Ritter, who started the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Obviously, some of our famous citizens have included Raquel Welch, and other people who have contributed names and importance to our community. Anna Held, the founder of the Green Dragon Colony, is definitely one of those. I've been writing a lot about the Green Dragon Colony. I think it's absolutely fascinating how Anna Held, who had been a nanny to U.S. Grant Jr., who had come here to see to the building of the U.S. Grant Hotel in downtown San Diego in the 1880s, I think, 1880s, 1890s. Anyway, Mr. Grant had come out here, and of course, Anna Held was working for him and taking care of his children. So they came to San Diego for a bit to live, and I think the family settled someplace, Bakersfield or Mission Hills. And then Anna Held, she took a carriage out to La Jolla in 1894, 95, around in there, and decided she wanted to buy some land here, of course, and that was the start of the Green Dragon Colony. So many people were attracted to the Green Dragon Colony, writers, theater people. Anna Held had been great friends with Ellen Terry, the great Shakespearean actress, who had done all the Shakespeare dramas at the Lyceum in London in the 1880s. And so Ellen Terry made several visits to La Jolla, And she also was friends with the man who had Irving Gill build a house for him. His name was Wheeler Bailey. Very famous Irving Gill house, which is still existing on Princess Street. And so the whole, um, the people who surrounded Anna Held at the Green Dragon Colony, amazingly interesting and great source of stories, and it never stops because when I first came to work for the La Jolla Historical Society here in, I don't know, it's been about almost 20 years ago, I think. Um, anyway, I was looking around for interesting things to do and stories to write and all that sort of thing. And I was looking at all these photographs of the Green Dragon Colony, and they included a lot of dolls. Anna Hill was a doll collector, okay? And she handmade a lot of her own dolls. But I noticed in the photograph that there were always there was always one doll that really stood out, and it was always identified as Olive Mishap. And so I became very intrigued about, okay, the other dolls probably ended up in the trash dump or whatever. She gave them to somebody. But, and the doll was so large in the photograph, and I think, oh, whatever happened to this doll? So I was writing a column for one of the local newspapers at the time. And so I wrote a column about, what happened to Anna Held's doll. Well, nobody came up and said, I've got the doll in my attic or anything for a while, but eventually someone did. And the doll arrived coming through the front door here at the History Society in a shoebox. And it was in pieces. And I looked at the doll and I thought, it could have, it wasn't an ordinary doll, and it needed a lot of conservatory work and repair and to be put back together again and strung and whatever. And so I called an antiquarian that I knew, and I said, I have this doll, and I think it's Anna Hill's doll from the 1890s and in the early 20th century when she lived here in La Jolla. And he said, well, see if the doll has a pedigree. Look on the back of its neck. And those early doll makers, or doll makers of that historic period, would often stamp the name of their factory on the back of it and their name. And so I did. I lifted up the wig and I looked at the back of the neck of the doll, and it said Nicholas Steiner, J. Nicholas Steiner, and Jules Nicholas Steiner. I'm sorry, I forgot the name. Anyway, so I called him back and he said, well, I think that's a fairly well-known French Parisian doll maker of that time. So I ended up finding this lady in someplace back east. I think she lived in upstate New York. Anyway, she collected these Steiner dolls, and she was very excited when I found this one. And she said, of course, the first thing you need to do is send it to a conservator and etc. So we did that, and I wrote a story about the doll and getting the doll, and the doll was debuted at the La Jolla Historical Society 50th anniversary celebration with a dress that the doll didn't come with a wardrobe. Okay, so we had a dress made by Zandra Rhodes, and we debuted the doll at our 50th anniversary party. So I thought, well, I'll go on to another subject and write about something else next. And then I got this letter in the mail, and the letter said, came from Washington, D.C., and a lady identified herself, and she said, I have Anna Hill's doll. And I think, no, 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 we've already settled this matter, and we have Anna Hill's doll in our collection, Olive Mishap. And she said, oh no, she said, my grandmother, my great grandmother actually, um, uh, has Anna Held. I have a letter, she said, from 1916 saying that Anna Held gave the doll to my grandmother. And I said, oh. And she said, oh, my doll is named Olive Haps. And I said, well, look on the back, and is it a Steiner doll? She said, yeah, it's a Steiner doll. It says right on the back of the neck. And I have a trunk of doll clothes that goes with it that describes how the doll clothes were made in London by Ellen Terry when she was at the theater and was waiting to go on stage and da, da, da. So anyway, this was also very intriguing. And the lady wanted to get rid of the doll. Okay, she was downsizing. She was going on a long trip, and so she said, "Would you like to have the doll with your other doll at the History Society?" And so we decided, yes, we would. And so she sent Olive Haps out here. Well, it ended up the dolls looked very, very similar, but the dolls that we had pictured in the archive were both Olive Haps and Olive Mishaps. And somebody along the line had identified both dolls as Olive Mishap. So, I wrote a story for the La Jolla Ascendio History Journal, and these are the two dolls, and they are wearing vintage costumes from the red dress that the doll is wearing is actually hand stitched by Ellen Terry, and I forgot the significance of the other doll's costume, but and the red dress is Olive Mishap, and the one in the blue dress is Olive Haps. So anyway, we now have both dolls in our collection. So it's kind of interesting how one thing always leads to another when you start doing research as a writer. And I've always enjoyed the research of it. I think sometimes more than the writing is okay, but sometimes you have to look out for find different words and new words, and there's always endless possibilities. So let's see, what else do we need to talk about here? Yeah, another thing I like to I like to find characters in La Jolla. Some of the people who have lived here, you know, off and on. I think in contemporary times, we often think of La Jolla. Oh, it's a wealthy community. You know, oh, it's always been a wealthy community because of Ellen Writing Scripps and her philanthropy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a lot of very poor people lived here too. And a lot of people that came to live in La Jolla lived in La Jolla on a very temporary basis. They didn't come as permanent residents, especially in the very early days where we didn't, in the very early days, we didn't have hotels really. And, but we did have a lot of small beach cottages that people just came here to live for a season, a winter or summer, and they would rent the cottages. And a lot of the pioneer families that were permanent residents, they actually were had started building cottages and renting them. A guy named Walter Lee there, who was here, came out here from Philadelphia, not intending to stay, but he did stay, and he built a whole series of these small beach cottages that he rented and made a nice living at it in those days. So I think, but oftentimes we overlook uh, the small people, shall we say. And there were so many interesting people. And I wrote a story one time called Rogues and what was it called? There you go. This is a story. It's called Royals, Rogues, and Secrets, and it was about basically pretty much some of the early people here in La Jolla. There was a guy named Dixon that nobody could really figure out. Mr. Dixon is this chap right here. He lived on Roslyn Lane. He lived in a cottage that was known as the Humpty Dumpty Cottage, okay? And nobody in La Jolla could really figure out where this guy came from. He seemed to be a wealthy gentleman because he is described in oral histories as wearing gold cufflinks and white shirts. And you can see in this picture he's very dapper. And but there was another side of him. Sometimes people just thought he had absolutely no wealth of any kind. because he would go around town knocking on doors and asking if he could do garden work. So he was either maybe a very, different sort of personality, or he was maybe wealthy and maybe poor. I never did really find out. I did find out that he loved to cook. There was an oral history that talked about his famous, I think it was macaroni and cheese or something like that. And he loved to socialize. I mean, he one time he gave a party for some guests of his, and he threw the party in the Sunny Jim Cave. And the oral history mentions that a number of guests just got up and left because it wasn't the macaroni and cheese they didn't like. They didn't like the dismal atmosphere of the clammy old cold cave. So anyway, Mr. Dixon, um, this fellow here is known as Lord Hubert. He's staying at in this photograph, he's staying at the Green Dragon Colony, and he's walking with Anna Held, who is pictured with him here. Mr. He was a British lord, we think. He always said he was a British lord, but he stayed at the Green Dragon Colony for quite some time, and he he actually drove the first what was called an automobile in La Jolla in I think either 1903 or 1905, one of those years. And the automobile is pictured here. You can see it. It's not much of a car. It's more like a wagon with a gear shift on it. Anyway, he was making a turn here on Prospect Street in La Jolla in this vehicle, and somebody leaned on the steering mechanism, and the car turned over. And of course, in that time, La Jolla had a population of maybe 150, 200 people, and they all came running, and nobody was hurt. But um, nobody would ride ever again with Mr. Hebert in the vehicle because they were all scared of the automobile. And it wasn't until Anson Mills came along some years later, and he actually had, I think, a Model T automobile that he drove around La Jolla. And people were had seen more automobiles here and there, and they were more accustomed, and they weren't half scared to death of them. So anyway, so people that I write about that nobody really knows very much about, and I pull them out and find something, and as the saying goes, everybody has a story. Okay. I don't know. Are we getting to the end of our time here, or how's the time going? Anybody?
You can go on a little longer. I handled a couple questions that I could answer in text, but we don't really have any right now. If you want to tell another story, that'd be great.
Okay. Let's see. Another story. What do we have here? Oh, one of my favorite stories. Again, it's a story from the early days in La Jolla. Um, there was a woman here in the 1890s who was a performer. She was an aeronaut. Um, Essentially, she went up in a parachute or went up in a balloon and parachuted back to the shoreline. And she would do this on 4th of July occasions, especially when there were a lot of visitors to La Jolla. And La Jolla had even in the very early years of the late 19th century, La Jolla was known for its fireworks explosion at the Cove every year. So the railroad decided they wanted to get people to come here and buy lots. And so the railroad decided that people would be much more apt to come if they had something to look at besides seashells and sea mosses and that sort of thing. So they decided to invite these entertainers who would perform various feats at the cove and around the shoreline. The most well known, of course, was Horace Poole. He was a diver, and he would jump from the cliff uh, and turn somersaults as he went down. And the cliff would be about 30 feet above the ocean on Goldfish Point. And he did several of these jumps, and then one one Fourth of July, he actually um, set himself on fire with gasoline and made the jump like a spinning fireball. And he lived to tell about it and died quite elderly, I think, on Coronado at some point in time. But anyway, this woman, Hazel Keys, was one of those entertainers that was hired by the railroad, and she kind of, entertained as an aeronaut up and down the coast. She would go as far up the coastline as Seattle in the state of Washington and perform these jumps. Well, the thing wasn't just that she performed the jump; she had a pet monkey who performed the jump with her, and the pet monkey's name was Jenny Yin Yang, and the monkey would go up with her, and then she would put its little parachute mechanism outfit on, and when she was ready to jump, the monkey jumped in tandem, and he landed quite nicely around La Jolla Cove, and she'd get up and do the thing again. And a while back, somebody came. I had written some stories about her here and there, and was trying to do more research to find out more to tell people about. And so a gentleman came in the office one day, and he said he was researching early aerial life or aerial performances, around the Southwest. And he was from Phoenix, I believe. Anyway, so I just casually mentioned, people didn't always jump out of airplanes around here; they jumped out of balloons and that sort of thing. And so I mentioned Hazel Keys to him. Well, he became so infatuated and so you know, curious about Hazel Keys that he ended up writing his book not about early, airplanes and stuff like that, but he ended up writing a book, a paperback, about Hazel Keys. And after it was published, I did this story and kind of filled in my information about what it from him and quoted the book about Hazel and her exploits. But it was really, they called her the Annie Oakley of the air, and she was really quite daring. And she ended up, I think she ended up living someplace up in the Northwest, and she ended up as a farmer. I think she was tired of the jumping life and decided to raise radishes, apples, something. Okay, thank you. I think that we could go maybe to some questions if anybody has some.
Oh, let me see. There's a couple coming in. Well, we have a couple of comments, actually.
Okay.
Thank you for your stories, and I especially appreciated hearing Chandler's description of La Jolla in the 1950s. And found this an interesting lecture about the famous people and writers. I was able to learn about some historical buildings through the eyes of writers.
Well, good. I want to, I want to comment a little bit about Chandler. I do a guided walking tour of, the sites around La Jolla that Raymond Chandler frequented, and we read from the playback book, and I do that tour on a regular basis, along with some village walking tours, guided walking tours of the village. Sometimes we go into neighborhoods. I've done one on a barber track, and so we try to educate people about La Jolla history. May as well plug the La Jolla Historical Society while we've got a chance here. La Jolla Historical Society was founded in 1963. It was an outgrowth of what we talked about earlier, the History Committee at the Library Association. and Mr. Randolph was very instrumental in gathering the first photographs that we have as the nucleus of our photographic collection, which now numbers about 30,000 photographs dating to the late 19th century and proceeding into the years of the mid-century and the present day. We mainly, we have a museum that we operate here in Wisteria Cottage, which was built in 1904. And we do 3 exhibitions in the museum per year. We're not your regular historical society museum. We don't exclusively feature our photographic collection, like old pictures on the wall. We build exhibitions around some of the ideas of history in La Jolla. We involve a lot of contemporary artists. We have a number of shows. We have had a number of shows about architects and apprentices of Frank Lloyd Wright from Taliesin West, who have built a lot of the well-known mid-century houses we have along the cliffs here and on the shoreline. We have a show coming up in September that we're very excited about. It's a collaboration with the Getty Foundation, and it will be held in our museum as well as at 2 other locations in the San Diego County area, and it's on the California work of Helen and Newton Harrison, who were important, significant ecological artists and part of the first visual arts department at UCSD. I think it will be a very interesting exhibit. Mr. Harrison did, when he was working, he deceased recently. He did work in the early 70s. There was an exhibition that involved live ducks that was called La Jolla Promenade, that was held in the courtyard at the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, which is our La Jolla Museum on Prospect. And so anyway, that exhibition will open on the 19th of September and comprise our fall and winter show running through the first part of January. Generally, our collection, archive collection, we have some fine art. We have a small library of the collection. We have some artifacts, like the dolls I mentioned, for instance, and other things from early history of La Jolla. And we have a lot of informational records. We have records from the La Jolla Women's Club, which was a very important facility here in early La Jolla, founded with the help of Ellen Browning Scripps and located in the famous Irving Gill structure we have here on Draper. We have records from like St. James by the Sea Episcopal Church, first church built in 1908, I believe, and designed by Irving Gill, a small mission-style church that was moved when they built the new church in 1928. And the new church was actually designed by Irving Gill's nephew, Louis Gill, who was an architect in his own right here in San Diego, and actually contributed a lot of the civic architecture that we have in San Diego, including he was one of the architects on the San Diego County Civic Center at the foot of Broadway, and also did a lot of design work. Mr. Louis Gill designed a lot of structures for the San Diego Zoo, including the world famous aviary that was the largest of its time free-flight aviary. It was designed and built in 1937 as a Works Progress Administration project, WPA project.
We do have a couple of questions, and we're just about out of time. If I could get those to you. Other than the Gills, who were the primary architects in La Jolla during the early days?
Early days, basically one guy, Irving Gill. Um, there were others that came along with the arts and crafts movement in California. Emmer Brooke Weaver comes to mind. He designed at least maybe one house here, possibly two. We don't know about the second one, if it's really an Emmer Brooke Weaver or not. Um, but the house he designed was for Jane Easton. It stood for many years on Torrey Pines Road, and unfortunately, a developer bought it, and it was moved out of La Jolla and resurrected in Poway.
Wow.
I think one of the reasons we don't have a lot of architect designed houses in the very early days, architect designed houses in La Jolla came along in the 1920s. La Jolla had a great period of development in the 1920s. One thing happened was the electric trolley system came to serve us from downtown San Diego and operated from 1924 to 1941. Second thing is the subdivisions that we have around the village area were developed in the 1920s. Lower Hermosa, Upper Hermosa, La Jolla Shores, and of course the Marylands with the big estates like the Mira Estate on Mount Soledad area. So all of those subdivisions and developments happened during the 1920s. Another thing that added greatly to the reputation of La Jolla in the 1920s as a resort community was the fact that we had really fine hotels that went up. La Valencia, 1926-27, and those, of course, were designed by architects. Thomas Shepard contributed to the La Valencia. Thomas Shepard was an architect of a little later period, but a very traditional architect. Edgar Ulrich was a major contributing architect to a little bit later period. And of course, we go into the mid-century years where we have guys like Robert Mosier. Oh, and I want to add one lady architect to that group from the earlier 20s, 30s, which would be Florence Palmer. She designed four storybook cottages on Fern Glen, two of which I think now have historic designation from the city of San Diego. And she designed a few other buildings. But the mid-century years were very rich because a lot of the guys that were wanting to be architects, they studied under G.I. Bill. And they went to Taliesin West to study outside of Scottsdale with the fellowship of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so, and they came back here to La Jolla to design houses and some civic buildings and some buildings that we have in downtown La Jolla. Guys like Robert Mosier, Russell Forrester, Locke Crane, Simbris Richards, and the list sort of goes on, and we're still exploring a lot of the work of those architects. And we have actually we've started doing a mid-century modern home tour. Last year it sold out, and this year we're doing another one, mid-century modern, and I think it's going to be held on the 5th of August. And if you're interested, go to our website. You can buy tickets through the website, and but do it fast because I think it's probably going to sell out too. So those are architects around La Jolla, in La Jolla, and yeah. Any other questions?
We're just about out of time, so we're going to wrap it up now. Hey, thank you, Carol. That was a really interesting lecture. I loved learning about all the authors that lived in La Jolla. I had no idea. I didn't even know Raymond Chandler was there. So thank you for today. I'd also like to thank our extraordinary volunteer, Janet O'Day, whose work behind the scenes has made this lecture series possible. She couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, but she will be watching the video. And thank you to our audience. We hope you'll join us on August 10th when Historian and planner for California State Parks Department, James Newland, will present La Mesa. And remember that the books discussed in this series can be purchased at the Marston House Museum shop. Thank you all for your support of Soho, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
You're welcome.